The interpreter stopped translating, not because he had forgotten the words, because he needed a moment to decide whether what Muhammad Ali had just said to the senior Soviet official across the table was something he was actually being asked to put into Russian, in the Kremlin, in the presence of officials for whom the translation of certain kinds of statements carried consequences that the interpreter would be the first person to absorb. He looked at Ali. Ali was looking at the official with the expression of someone who has said what he said and is waiting for the other person to hear it. The interpreter translated. The official was quiet for a moment. Then he said something in Russian. The interpreter translated it. It was not what anyone in the room had expected him to say. The meeting in the Kremlin in the fall of 1978 was not a meeting that had been arranged through the ordinary diplomatic channels. It was a meeting that existed in the specific space between official and unofficial that certain kinds of encounters between famous people and governments occupy. Real enough to happen, informal enough that neither side had to fully account for it through the mechanisms that formal meetings produced. Muhammad Ali was in Moscow. The Soviet government wanted to meet with Muhammad Ali. To understand what Ali said in that room and why the interpreter paused, and what the official's unexpected response revealed about the position Muhammad Ali occupied in the world by the fall of 1978, you have to understand what brought him to Moscow and what the Soviet government thought it was getting when it arranged the meeting, and what the Soviet government's framework for people like Muhammad Ali had been built to process, and what it had not been built to process. The 1980 Moscow Olympics were 2 years away. The question of American participation in those Olympics was already alive in Washington, in ways that would not become publicly visible for another 18 months, but that people inside the American government and inside the international sports world were already thinking about and discussing in the specific, careful language of things that had not yet been decided, and that discussing too explicitly might affect the deciding. The shadow of a potential boycott was present without having been named, and both governments were aware of it and were maneuvering around it in the way that governments maneuver around things that have not yet become official policy. The Soviet government, for its part, was intensely motivated to cultivate relationships with prominent Americans who might, when the question became public, have something to say about it that carried weight with audiences the Soviet government could not directly reach. This was not a new approach. The Soviet Union had been engaged for decades in the specific project of identifying and cultivating the prominent Americans whose positions on American foreign policy overlapped with Soviet interests, because those Americans carried credibility with domestic American audiences that Soviet spokespeople and Soviet media could not carry. The approach had worked in some cases and failed in others, and what it had produced in its successes was not so much agreement as the appearance of agreement, famous people whose statements could be quoted by Soviet media in ways that served Soviet purposes without the famous people necessarily endorsing what the statements were being used to support. Muhammad Ali was, in 1978, the most famous person in the world. He was the most famous Muslim in the world. He was a man whose refusal of military service had been vindicated by the Supreme Court, and who had spent 3.5 years in exile for positions that the Soviet propaganda apparatus had been discussing for exactly that duration as evidence of American hypocrisy. He was commercially dominant in a way that gave his statements access to audiences across every geography. He was politically independent in a way that the Soviet framework interpreted through its own models as meaning he was available to be aligned. The Soviet framework was wrong about the independence. It had a model for opposition to American foreign policy that said people who oppose American foreign policy are, in the essential structure of their opposition, aligned with the Soviet position, because the Soviet position defines itself primarily as the opposition to American foreign policy. In that model, Muhammad Ali's draft refusal and his exile were evidence of an alignment that had not yet been formalized into explicit cooperation. The meeting was an opportunity to formalize it. What the model could not process was the possibility that Muhammad Ali's independence was genuinely independent, that it was not opposition to American authority in the sense that made it potentially available for Soviet direction, but a consistency of conscience that operated on its own axis, and that was as resistant to Soviet claim as it was to American claim. The Soviet officials who arranged the meeting had a framework for people who opposed American power. They did not have a framework for a man whose only allegiance was to his own conscience, which was a thing that Soviet frameworks were structurally unable to accommodate, because the Soviet framework had no conceptual space for a conscience that belonged exclusively to the person who held it, and was not available for institutional direction of any kind. Muhammad Ali was in Moscow because Muhammad Ali went where he was invited, if the invitation was genuine and if the going served purposes he could identify with his own values. He had been invited. The Soviet people, not the government, the people, the athletes and the ordinary citizens and the boxing fans who had followed his career across 20 years of his being the most famous athlete in the world, were people he had genuine warmth for. He had no antagonism toward Soviet citizens, the same way he had no antagonism toward the Vietnamese people he had said he had no quarrel with in 1967. His positions were not about populations. They were about governments and power, and what power did to the people who were subject to it. The Soviet people were subject to the Soviet government. That was a relevant distinction. The meeting was with the Soviet government. That was also a relevant distinction. The meeting room in the Kremlin was formal in the way that rooms used for meetings between Soviet officials and foreign visitors were formal. The table, the chairs, the specific bureaucratic solemnity of a space where the Soviet state received people it wished to be seen receiving. The officials who were present represented the intersection of Soviet cultural and sports administration, which was the bureaucratic location where the Moscow Olympics lived. The senior official present was not Brezhnev. Brezhnev was unwell by this period, and the meeting was below the level at which he was personally engaged, but a senior aide whose position in the Soviet hierarchy placed him at the level where the Olympics preparation was actually being managed, and where the question of American participation was actively being thought about. Through the interpreter, the opening of the meeting proceeded in the way that such meetings proceed: expressions of welcome, acknowledgments of Ali's fame and accomplishment, the specific warmth that Soviet officialdom deployed toward foreign visitors it wanted to impress. Ali received the warmth with the genuine courtesy he brought to most situations. He was not rude to people who were being nice to him, regardless of his opinions about the larger context of the niceness. And the opening proceeded well enough. Then the official made the move the meeting had been arranged to make. Through the interpreter, he expressed the Soviet government's admiration for Muhammad Ali's history of standing against American militarism. He referenced the draft refusal. He referenced the years of exile and the Supreme Court vindication. He framed all of this, carefully, as evidence of a shared understanding between Ali and the Soviet Union about the nature of American power and its uses in the world. The framing was not crude. It had been prepared. It was designed to create the impression that Muhammad Ali's convictions and the Soviet Union's positions were in their essential character aligned. Ali listened to the full translation. Then he said the thing that made the interpreter pause. He said that he appreciated the warmth of the reception and that he had great respect for the Soviet people, who were not the same thing as the Soviet government in the way that the American people were not the same thing as the American government. He said that his refusal to serve in Vietnam had been based on his faith and his conscience, which were his and belonged to no government and no ideology, and had not been available for the American government to direct, and were equally unavailable for the Soviet government to claim. He said that he had come to Moscow because he believed that athletes and the sports they practiced belonged, as much as possible, to the space between the governments that used them as instruments, and that he was not in this room as an instrument of anyone's position about the Moscow Olympics or about anything else. He looked at Ali. Ali was looking at the official with the expression of someone who has said what he said, and is waiting for the translation to allow the other person to hear it. The interpreter translated. The official was quiet for a longer moment than the pauses that had preceded the other translations. The people in the room, the Soviet aides, the members of Ali's traveling party, the interpreter, were in the specific quality of attention that falls when something has been said that has changed the temperature of the room, and nobody yet knows what the changed temperature will produce. Then the official said something. The interpreter translated it. The official said that Muhammad Ali was, in his experience, the first foreign visitor to the Kremlin in his years of working in this function who had said explicitly and to his face that he had not come as anyone's instrument. He said he found this, after considerable reflection across the pause, to be the most direct and honest thing he had heard in this room in a long time. He said that he personally respected it, even if the government he represented had hoped for something different from the meeting. There was a further pause. Then the official asked Ali a question that was not on the agenda, and that the interpreter translated with the specific care of someone translating something they had not been prepared to translate. He asked Ali what he believed the Moscow Olympics should be, not what he thought the American government would do, what he, Muhammad Ali, personally believed should happen. Ali said he believed the athletes of the world should compete, that what athletes produced when they competed was not a statement about the governments of the countries they represented, but a demonstration of what human beings could do when they directed their full capacity toward something. That governments used sports for their purposes and would continue to use them, and that this was not a new phenomenon and was not going to end because someone wished it would end, but that within the competition itself, within the specific thing that happened between athletes in a ring or on a track or in a pool, there was something that governments could frame but could not own. He said he had spent his career in that thing. The official listened to this through the interpreter. He said in his final statement of the meeting that he had expected from this meeting a conversation about politics and had received instead a conversation about something he was less accustomed to discussing in this room, which was principle. He said that the distinction Muhammad Ali made between athletes and the governments that claimed them was a distinction that he personally found, and he used a word that the interpreter rendered as either compelling or troubling, and was not certain which was the more accurate translation, so he offered both. The meeting ended shortly after. Ali was escorted out of the Kremlin with the full courtesy that the Soviet protocol for the departure of visitors it wished to remember as positive encounters demanded. The official did not accompany him to the exit. He remained at the table. 2 years later, the United States boycotted the Moscow Olympics. Muhammad Ali was, briefly, a part of the diplomatic effort around the boycott. The Carter administration approached him about serving as an envoy to African nations, asking them to join the American-led boycott. Ali went. The African nations he visited were not persuaded, in part because Ali himself was not persuaded, in part because the argument for the boycott rested on the premise that sports could be used as a political instrument in ways that Ali had told a Soviet official in the Kremlin 2 years earlier he did not believe in. The interpreter who had paused before translating what Ali said in that meeting gave an account of it years later, when the Soviet Union no longer existed and the account was safe and possible to give publicly. He said that in 20 years of translating for Soviet officials in formal meetings with foreign visitors, he had paused before translating a statement exactly once. He said that the statement he had paused before translating was the statement Muhammad Ali made about not being anyone's instrument. He said he had paused because he needed to confirm to himself that he had understood the statement correctly before he rendered it into Russian in the Kremlin, because he had not, in 20 years, translated a statement of that precise kind in that room, and he wanted to be certain that what he was about to say was what had actually been said. It was. He translated it. The official heard it, and the official said the thing that nobody in the room had expected him to say. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold moments from Muhammad Ali's life, in the rooms where history was being made and where he consistently said the thing that nobody expected him to say. Share this with someone who needs to understand that genuine independence is the kind that belongs to no side, and that the most powerful statement a person can make to a powerful government is that they have not come as anyone's instrument. Leave a comment telling us what you think the Soviet official understood in that pause that he had not understood before the interpreter translated.